What we have to understand here is that when a narcissist experiences a collapse, we're not simply witnessing disappointment or heartbreak, we're witnessing a kind of psychological disintegration. The image they've spent years constructing, often unconsciously, begins to crack. And that image isn't superficial for them, it's structural. It holds their entire sense of self together. So when it falters, what emerges is not just pain, but a profound inner dysregulation. Now, most people assume that in such a moment, a person would naturally turn toward love, toward someone they feel deeply connected to. But that assumption is rooted in a healthy model of attachment. For someone operating from a narcissistic structure, the priority is not connection at stabilization. It's the urgent need to escape the unbearable internal state that has suddenly surfaced. So instead of asking, who do they love? The more accurate question becomes, who helps them feel less fragmented? Because that is the function they are seeking. They are not moving toward intimacy, they are moving away from collapse. And this is where it becomes counterintuitive. The person they reach for is often not the one who challenged them to grow, not the one who held them accountable, and certainly not the one who saw through their defenses. In fact, those individuals, however healthy or grounded, may feel threatening in this moment. Why? Because they require presence. They require authenticity. And authenticity is precisely what feels most dangerous when the false self is crumbling. Instead, the narcissist is drawn to whoever has historically acted as a regulator of their emotional state. This might be someone who offered consistent validation, someone who absorbed their projections without resistance, or someone who provided a predictable sense of admiration or control. It could even be a person they previously discarded. What matters is not the depth of the bond, but the reliability of the function. This tells us something very important about the nature of their attachment. It is not rooted in mutual recognition, but in emotional utility. The other person becomes a kind of external nervous system, someone who can quickly soothe the anxiety, restore the illusion, and help them reassemble their identity without having to confront the underlying wound. If we look at this through the lens of early development, it begins to make sense. When a child grows up in an environment where their authentic self is not fully seen or accepted, they adapt. They construct a version of themselves that can secure approval, avoid rejection, or maintain some sense of control. But that adaptation comes at a cost: the loss of genuine self-regulation. Instead of learning how to sit with discomfort, they learn how to escape it, often through others. So later in life, when that carefully maintained identity collapses, they don't have the internal resources to process it. There's no stable core to return to. And so the impulse is external, immediate, almost reflexive. They seek out the person who can restore equilibrium as quickly as possible. And this is why the behavior can be so confusing to those on the receiving end. It may look like vulnerability, it may even feel like closeness, but what's actually happening is something much more mechanical. It's a form of emotional survival. The connection is not about being seen, it's about not falling apart. And until that distinction is understood, the pattern repeats. Because you cannot build a real relationship on the foundation of regulation alone. At some point, the illusion fades again, and the same cycle begins. So when a narcissist runs to someone after a collapse, they're not choosing love, they're choosing relief. And relief, no matter how intense, is not the same as healing. If we continue from that understanding that the narcissist is not seeking love, but regulation, then the next question becomes, why this person and not someone else? Why, in the moment of collapse, do they so often gravitate toward a very particular kind of individual? And the answer lies in something deeper than preference. It lies in familiarity with a role that has already been established, often long before the collapse ever occurred. The person they run to is rarely SLU cha a ikratkoi en yero ikratkoi. It is often someone who, knowingly or not, has participated in maintaining the narcissist's constructed identity, the false self. This is the version of the self that was built not out of authenticity, but out of adaptation. It is shaped by what was required to gain approval, avoid shame, or secure a sense of worth in an environment where those things were not freely given. Now, this false self needs reinforcement. It cannot sustain itself in isolation. It depends on reflection, on being mirrored back by others in a way that confirms its validity. And so, over time, certain people become associated with that function. They become, in a sense, extensions of the narcissist's psychological structure, not because they are weak or inferior, but because the dynamic itself has been unconsciously organized around this exchange. So when the collapse happens, when the illusion fractures, the narcissist doesn't randomly search for support. They return to the place where the illusion has historically been strongest. They seek out the person who still holds the image intact, or at least is most likely to restore it without resistance. This is why it is so often not the most emotionally mature or self-aware person in their life. A grounded, secure individual tends to relate to others based on reality, not illusion. They respond to what is actually there, not what is being projected. And in a moment of collapse, that kind of clarity can feel intolerable. It confronts the very thing the narcissist is trying to avoid: the dissonance between who they are and who they believe themselves to be. Instead, they are drawn to someone who sees them through a softer lens, or perhaps through an outdated one. It could be an old partner who still remembers them at their best, a friend who has always admired them, or someone who has difficulty asserting boundaries. What matters is that this person does not challenge the narrative. They allow the narcissist to step back into a familiar identity without having to reconstruct it from the ground up. And here's where it becomes important to be very clear. This is not a conscious manipulation in most cases. It is a deeply ingrained pattern. The narcissist is not sitting there strategically selecting the best option. Rather, they are moving toward what feels psychologically safe. And what feels safe is what is familiar, even if that familiarity is rooted in distortion. From a developmental perspective, this makes sense. If a child learned early on that their value depended on performing a certain role, being exceptional, being admired, being needed, then they also learn to associate certain relationships with that performance. Those relationships become anchors for the false self. They provide continuity, even when everything else feels unstable. So in the aftermath of a collapse, when the internal world feels chaotic and uncertain, the pull toward these anchors becomes incredibly strong. It is not about the present moment, it is about restoring a past equilibrium. It is about re-entering a dynamic where the rules are known and the outcome is predictable. But this is also where the limitation lies, because what is being restored is not the true self, it is the illusion of stability. The connection may feel intense, even reassuring, but it is built on a foundation that cannot evolve. It requires both people to remain in roles that ultimately prevent genuine intimacy. And so, while it may look like the narcissist is returning to someone meaningful, what they are really returning to is a mirror, one that reflects back not who they are, but who they need to believe they are in order to feel intact. And as long as that mirror remains unchallenged, the cycle continues. Because you cannot heal a fractured self by protecting the illusion that caused the fracture in the first place. If we follow this pattern a little further, it becomes even clearer why the narcissist doesn't move toward what is healthy in the aftermath of collapse, but toward what is familiar. And familiarity, in the psychological sense, is not defined by comfort in the way we usually think of it. It is defined by recognition, by patterns the nervous system already knows how to navigate, even if those patterns are painful. So rather than seeking out a grounded, reciprocal, emotionally mature connection, the narcissist is often pulled back into what we would call a trauma bond. This is a relationship dynamic shaped not by mutual presence, but by cycles of intensity, idealization, devaluation, withdrawal, and return. It's unstable, but it's predictable in its instability. And that predictability creates a kind of distorted safety. Now, from the outside, this can seem irrational. Why would someone, especially in a moment of vulnerability, choose a relationship that is inherently dysregulating? But the key here is that the dysregulation itself is familiar. It echoes earlier experiences where emotional inconsistency may have been the norm, where connection was intertwined with anxiety, where affection was unpredictable, where one had to adapt constantly to maintain some sense of belonging. In that kind of early environment, the nervous system learns to equate intensity with attachment. Calm, stable, consistent connection can actually feel foreign, even unsettling. It doesn't activate the same internal signals. It doesn't match the blueprint that was formed in childhood. And so, when a collapse occurs and the system is searching for something to hold on to, it doesn't necessarily recognize health as safe. It recognizes what it already knows. This is why a secure, emotionally available person may not even register as a viable option in that moment. Not because they lack value, but because they require something the narcissist cannot easily access during collapse: accountability, mutuality, and emotional presence. These are not just relational qualities, they are capacities that depend on a certain level of internal stability. And when that stability is gone, those expectations can feel overwhelming, even threatening. By contrast, a trauma-bonded relationship offers a kind of shortcut. The roles are already established. The emotional choreography is familiar. There is often an unspoken agreement built over time about how the dynamic functions. One pursues, the other withdraws. One soothes, the other destabilizes. It may not be conscious, but it is deeply ingrained. So when the narcissist returns to this kind of connection, they are not stepping into the unknown. They are stepping back into a script. And that script, however dysfunctional, provides immediate orientation. It tells them who they are, how to behave, and what to expect. In the midst of internal chaos, that sense of structure can feel like relief. But of course it comes at a cost. Because while the dynamic may reduce anxiety in the short term, it reinforces the very patterns that led to the collapse in the first place. It avoids the deeper work of integration, the process of facing the disowned parts of the self, tolerating discomfort, and developing a more authentic way of relating. And this is where we begin to see the difference between repetition and healing. Repetition is driven by familiarity. It pulls us back into what we already know, regardless of whether it serves us. Healing, on the other hand, requires a movement toward what is unfamiliar, but true. It asks for a different kind of engagement, one that is slower, more conscious, and often more uncomfortable at the beginning. For the narcissist in collapse, that path is not easily accessible. The pull of the familiar is too strong, the internal resources too limited. And so, the cycle continues not because it is desired, but because it is known. And until what is familiar is no longer mistaken for what is safe, the same patterns will repeat, no matter how many times they fall apart. And when you begin to see the pattern as a whole, this movement toward regulation, the return to those who sustain the false self, the pull of familiar trauma bonds, you start to understand something that is often deeply misunderstood. The narcissist's return, especially after a major collapse, is not fundamentally about the other person. It's about survival. Now, that word survival can sound dramatic, but psychologically, it's precise. Because what's being threatened in that moment is not just their mood or their circumstances. It's their sense of self. And when the self feels like it's disintegrating, the system responds with urgency. It looks for whatever can restore cohesion, whatever can reduce the internal fragmentation. And it does so quickly, often without reflection. So when they reach out to someone, sometimes someone they've hurt, someone they've discarded, or someone they seem to have moved on from, it can appear, on the surface, like longing or regret. It can look like they've finally recognized the value of that person. And for the one on the receiving end, this can be incredibly compelling. It can feel like meaning, like closure, even like love. But if we look more closely, what becomes evident is that the connection is being reactivated, not for its depth, but for its function. The other person is not being chosen for who they are in their full humanity, but for the role they can play in stabilizing the narcissist's internal world. It is, in a sense, a return to a known emotional resource. And this is where clarity becomes essential, because without it, there's a risk of misinterpreting the behavior, of believing that the intensity of the return reflects the depth of the feeling. But intensity, in this context, is not a measure of love, it is a measure of need. It reflects how urgently the system is trying to restore balance, not how deeply it is capable of connection. If the collapse begins to subside, if the narcissist starts to feel more regulated, more reassembled, you will often see a shift. The urgency fades, the attention changes, and the dynamic begins to resemble what it was before. Not because the earlier connection was false in every sense, but because it was never rooted in mutual recognition to begin with. It was rooted in a structure that serves a specific psychological purpose. And this can be difficult to accept, particularly for those who have invested emotionally in the relationship, because it challenges a very human hope that if someone comes back, it must mean something real has changed. But return in itself is not transformation. It can simply be repetition in a different moment of need. From a deeper perspective, this is not about blame. It's about understanding the limitations of a system that was formed under certain conditions. If someone has not developed the capacity for self-reflection, for emotional regulation, for authentic presence, then they are not yet ready to engage in these essential life skills. Then their relationships will inevitably be shaped by those absences, not out of malice, but out of adaptation. And so the return, however convincing it may feel, remains bound to the same underlying pattern. It cannot become something new unless the structure itself changes. And that kind of change requires something far more difficult than reaching out. It requires turning inward. It requires confronting the very emptiness that the return is designed to avoid. So when a narcissist comes back after collapse, it's not a moment of resolution. It's a moment of regulation, a temporary restoration of balance achieved through a familiar connection. And if there is one thing to take from this, it is this. Not every return is a sign of love sometimes. It is simply a strategy to survive what they cannot face alone.